Good morning, Rabbi.
Good morning.
Hello, Rabbi.
Hi, Estelle.
Been a while since I've been in this class.
We have missed you. I get to see you at other times, but this class has missed you, Estelle.
Hi, Liz. I see
Hi,
you back
Liz.
there. I see you
Nice
back.
to see you again.
That's my standard spot, the coffee pot.
Yes, that's right. Huh. Rabbi,
Yeah.
we didn't have class last Thursday, and I was going to tell you because the day before that was the Pidnia Ben I told you I was going to.
Oh, yeah.
And I want to tell you, it was so interesting to me. The Kohen was this elder. I say elder, he's probably younger than I am, but okay. Sephardic gentleman, a very religious man who really, he took it so seriously, the kahuna, you know what I mean? I enjoyed it a lot. You know, I mean, he both in English
circumstances then that you can function as a Kohen. I mean, there's Birkas Kohanim.
Right.
Yeah.
But he also in Hebrew and in English said, all the things you're supposed. Does the father want to give this? And of course,
there's like this little ceremony, like a play.
Yeah.
Each one has their lines.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Exactly. So I just thought it was neat. In a way, a friend of mine said it's so misogynistic. I hate it, but okay, that's never mind. Oh.
Okay.
Although the mother was asked too. Is that standard that the mother is also asked if she wants to redeem the baby?
Well, it might be, I mean, in other words, the real mitzvah is on the child to be redeemed. The parents are supposed to do it initially, but if the child's parents hadn't done it, the child himself would have to do it.
Oh,
mean,
really?
If the father, they would still do the pidyon of Ben. It's just, so I'm assuming that if there wasn't a father, the mother would be the one who.
I see.
Applied. So there's nothing wrong in asking her. But when the father does it, he's acting on behalf of, I would assume, the parents.
So if, let's say, the baby wasn't redeemed and becomes an adult, can you redeem yourself? Does he?
Yeah.
You pay the Kohen to be released?
Yeah, in fact, I've heard of people that do it because we're not sure who is a Kohen. So I've heard it. There are people that every once in a while, when they find a new Kohen, they'll ask them to do Pidyon Ben with them.
Huh.
It costs money. It doesn't cost a ton of money, but it does cost money. But
I don't know, there's a quarter sitting on the counter.
it's not a
in the
quarter.
other room. No, it's in the other room, there's a quarter, where I get
Okay.
the water.
There you go. It's a little bit more than a quarter.
Yeah.
But so I do know of people that I've thought of doing it. Also, there's certain family names that have a reputation for more likely being Kohanim than other people. Cohen is not one of those. Cohen and Katz is not. Or Rappaport, believe it or not, the Rappaport Kohanim. So I have heard of people that will, if they come across somebody like that, or somebody maybe who's an illustrious family going back many generations that can trace their family going back many generations, that might be a reason. Yes, so I have heard of that people will do Pidyon Ben. They do not get put on a silver platter, as far as I know. What was the baby on a silver platter in this one?
No, the baby was not.
Too bad. Particularly jarring to see your baby on a platter, especially because there's also custom put jewelry over them, and then you
Yes.
put like garlic, sugar cubes around because it's
What, is Dracula there?
auspicious
No.
to well, it's auspicious to then take the sugar cubes and the garlic and mix them in other things, and that because you get the special merit, it's like shiraim from the mitzvah. So they put all these things on the platter, and amongst them sugar cubes and garlic and jewelry all over the baby, and then the baby is like presented on a silver platter.
Yeah, at Shmuel Goodman's grandson. I remember that. It's on a platter with, yep.
I
Jewelry.
haven't, trying to remember the last time anyone had a pigeon event. And I can't remember.
They are not surprisingly, they're not that common. There should be 50%, well, not
No,
50%,
because it
but a
has
little
to
less
be
than 50.
firstborn son, right?
Right, so that would be 50%.
Firstborn child.
Right, so that would be, let's say, 50% starting off, because 50% boy or girl.
Right.
But then it doesn't apply if there was a cesarean.
No,
No, if there's a
No.
cesarean, you don't do it.
I did not.
Have to open the womb. And also, I was told that if there's a miscarriage and the miscarriage is after 6 weeks or beyond, then you don't do it also.
And if either the father or mother are from Cohen families or Levi families,
Right.
they don't do it. So I don't know what percentage you end up with, but I'm sure, I still think it should be above 30%.
Maybe.
If you're starting at 50%, and then you're knocking out miscarriages and cesarean sections,
And not being firstborn.
well, again, firstborn is either going to be a girl or boy.
Right.
So that's 50% chance. So you're starting with 50% chance. Now you're of the first child,
Yeah.
and now you're knocking out cesarean sections and miscarriages.
Okay.
I don't know what percentage that represents, but let's say it knocks it down to by 10%. And then you have Levim and Kohanim, and that, let's say that knocks it down another 10%.
I think you're knocking too much off now.
But so then why don't we see more?
I don't.
Because
Now I-
people don't do it. You know, David's cousins who were twins, the older boy had a Pinya Ben, not, you know, Mark and Michael had. So Mark,
It didn't work out.
Those PK people?
yep. Yeah,
Ah, thought it was someone I knew.
The my oldest son, AY, we call him AY, Abraham Yosef. He in Israel, it's more common for the bris to be pushed off. The moilim are more careful about things like jaundice and not doing brisses if the baby's a little bit under the weather. Here,
Makes
they're
sense.
not as concerned. I mean, they're still concerned, but it's rarer to have a bris pushed off here than it is in Israel. So, but
Unless, unless the baby is sick.
so our first two boys did not have their brisses on the 8th day. And AY's was pushed off for a couple weeks.
Wow.
And it was close enough that he might have had his pigeon ben before his bris. And I asked her, Moshe Shapiro, God bless him, I told him I heard that some people have accustomed to name the baby at the pigeon ben if the pigeon ben is before the bris, because our child, it's sort of weird to go for a couple of weeks and your kid doesn't have a name.
Yeah, exactly.
So he looked at me and he goes, if you're going to give him a name like yours, give it to him now, because all my friends called me Andy. And so he was saying, like, if you're giving him a name like yours, then just give it to him now. Don't even wait for the bris. But he then said that you don't do it. If the pigeon ben is before, you still wait for the bris. and it worked out that the bris was before the Pidyon of Ben, but not by much. I think it was only a week before. This
Hmm.
Pidyon. And I still remember that Pidyon of Ben.
You were,
Okay.
you were considering, I don't know. It just gives you that Jack Benny feeling, you know, when he's being robbed and they say your money or your life.
I'm
And he
thinking-
says, I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about it. Yeah.
I'm sure there's been a father who's done that
Yeah.
line, because it does wait, it does ask for that right there.
Yep.
Yep.
When you think about the fact that you got put through school, you gotta pay for his college, and you gotta do. Yeah, I'm thinking about it.
Okay, we are, I think we're on the slaves. Is that
Oh, yeah.
possible that we're on the
That's where
slaves?
this is, a Jewish
Okay.
slave, a Jew's Jewish slave is what it says.
Okay, so I think we did that part. But I don't think we did the Gentile slaves part. I think we did the Jewish slave part. And but I think we're on the Gentile slave part, which is in 44.
Yeah, one I should read.
Yeah, just 44 through 46.
Okay. Your slave or your maidservant whom you may own from the Gentiles who surround you, from among them you may purchase a slave or a maidservant. Also from among the children of the residents who live with you, from them you may purchase, from their family that is with you, whom they begot in your land, and they shall remain yours as an ancestral heritage. You shall hold them as a heritage for your children after you to inherit as a possession. You shall work with them forever, but with your brethren, the children of Israel, a man with his brother, you shall not subjugate him through hard labor.
Okay. I believe we've talked in the past about owning Gentile slaves. The distinction between, this is one of the places that talks about the distinction between your behavior with a Jewish slave, with a Jewish servant and a Gentile slave. So let's just begin by reviewing the difference between a Jewish slave and a Gentile slave. When you own a Jewish slave, you do not own his body. He is not a personal
Possession.
commodity.
It's not a
Right, he's not a
technical
possession. What you own is his output. He is a fully Jewish person. He or she is fully Jewish, which means that they are obliged in all the mitzvot. And if it's a male, he's also still obliged in time-bound mitzvot, which means he has to daven 3 times a day, and he has to daven within the approved times, time constraints. He has to have an opportunity to fulfill all the mitzvot of a human being, of a Jewish male.
Right.
And he has all the restrictions, all the, what we would call the negative commandments. And he has, these are both biblical and rabbinic. So not only do you not own his person, but you are limited as to even what you can ask from him as far as work goes. because he's going to have all these times where he's not going to be able to do work for you.
Right.
So that's A. Also, you don't own him indefinitely. You own his work until Shemitah, whenever Shemitah is. So let's say you bought him, or again, bought the right to his work right after, like right now. In the Shemitah cycle, we're right after Shemitah has ended. So that means there's going to be 6 years, 6 full years till the next Shemitah. So you would own him for those 6 years. If he chooses, he would stay on with you afterwards. He could stay on with you afterwards with the same basic rules that he had before. Now, he cannot choose, this is part of his servitude, he cannot choose what he does for you, as long as it's within Torah, within the Torah rules. He also cannot choose how to do it. I mean, his master obviously can tell him what to do and how to do it, which means that he might be somebody who's a poet, and you might have him, mixing cement, for 6 years. And that would be a kind of indication of his servitude. In other words, he's being asked to do things that he doesn't want to do. That would be an indication that he's a servant. Plus, he's not, when he's presented with something, he doesn't have the choice not to do it. There are halachic discussions about the relationship between an employer and an employee, or the relationship between somebody who contracts somebody to do work for them. So for instance, let's say, I recently read about it. I like to watch videos about tiny homes and RVs and things
I
like that.
just saw something about tiny home.
Right, so there's apparently a fraud case going on with some guy in Colorado who a bunch of people paid him to build tiny homes for them. And then he went bankrupt and seems to have squandered their money. So he could be charged with fraud, but there's nobody who could actually force him to make the tiny homes. Let's say there's 100 different people who've paid him to build a tiny home for them. So a judge can't say, let's say that this goes before a bankruptcy judge, and the judge says, you know what? I don't feel like this is a legitimate bankruptcy thing. You are fully capable of following through on what you said you were going to do. So you have to follow through on what it is that you said you do. You contracted with these people. You have to produce their product. So what you would call an anti-slavery clause or law in Jewish law suggests that you cannot force somebody to follow, even though he made an agreement. You can't, and you have an arrangement about work that he's supposed to do for you. You can't force him to do it. He has the right to pay you back, or maybe to go, himself into servitude for not following through and then pay it off that way. He has a responsibility to pay you back, but you can't force him to do work. That seems to be the definition of servitude or slavery. So when we call this guy a Jewish slave, he's not a slave in every way we imagine, but he is obliged to do work for you during that period of time, and he can't turn it down. What are the options? I'm assuming lashes from the courts and things like that are part of the options if he doesn't follow through, but he can be forced to do labor. Whereas a Jew who is not a servant cannot be forced to do labor. He could be sued, but you can't force him to do labor for you. So that having been said, there's another difference between a Jewish servant and a Gentile one. And that is what this last line. So this last line here was Lo tirda bo beforech. You shall not, it seems like, make him do forech. Now, forech, Aryeh Kaplan translates it as work, do not dominate one another to break one's spirit. Forech seems to be the kind of work that breaks your spirit. This is related to a description of the Jewish slavery in Egypt, that the particular, a lot of the work that the Jews were being asked to do is characterized in this same term, beforech. Now, what do you have in your notes there on that? The last words of 46.
Doesn't really say anything about 46. The whole thing from 44 to 46 says, having said that an owner's rights over his Jewish slaves are severely limited, the Torah states that one may purchase slaves from among the surrounding nations. Such slaves become the property of their owners. It really doesn't say anything about hard labor.
Okay, so this is in the first chapter of Shemot. It's it's a short line. Chapter 1, verse 13. It says, "V'yavidu Mitzrayim et bnei Yisrael befarech." And the Egyptians enslaved the Jews, worked the Jews befarech. And here he translates it miserable. They made the lives of Israel miserable with harsh labor. Oh no, that's the previous one. Labor designated to break their bodies is how Aryeh Kaplan chooses to translate it over there. But this is one of those words that gets a variety of translations, and it's one of the key kind of special words when it comes to slavery, and it's one of the ways they distinguish the Egyptian slavery for harshness. So let's just look at what our options are for this word, because this is also going to be a distinction between what you're supposed to do with a Jewish servant as opposed to with a Gentile slave. Again, we do not have slavery nowadays. We don't want there to be slavery nowadays, but we're talking about it in a time when they had slaves. Chapter 1, verse 13. So Rashi translates it avodah kasha, which means hard labor. Hamefarechet et haguf u mishabarto, that shatters or crushes the body. So it's designed to shatter or crush the body.
Painful.
It's what we think of when we think of the labor camps
Exactly.
during the Shoah. That was Rashi, Ibn Ezra. So Ibn Ezra quotes Onkelos. Ibn Ezra himself says the Egyptians worked them harder than slaves are normally worked. Onkelos explains the meaning of this term it is totally wrong to employ the form broken in when Pharaoh saw that the above measures did not stop the Israelites from increasing, he called them. Okay, so he doesn't like the word broken as used with this. Obviously, Rashi used something like that. Crushed used. He translates it as with rigor, something, I guess, harder than what is generally employed with slaves. What else do we have here? Malvin, let's see. So the Malbim says it refers to work without rest and without need. There's not a demonstrable need for the work, and you're not giving them rest. You're doing it to break them.
Yeah, for sure.
So that kind of work. That was Malbim. Let's see what Sforno says. The Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, says there is no real clear meaning for this word from the Torah. There's no way of deriving the exact meaning of it. He said this word, in other words, the word befarech itself, what is there some root, some etymology that we can see apparent from some other place in Tanakh? And he's saying there doesn't seem to be. He thinks it might be related to the word separate. And it might have to do with separating them from their wives. The Rosh says.
Not for us.
It could be in follow-up. Okay, so those are your options when translating it on the Egyptian exile. And since that seems to be our only reference for this word, that's what we're going to do in our case in 46. So it's one of those, depending on your interpretation over there, you would apply it over here. So it either means work that's designed to break the person, or work that has no, I guess there's similar, either it's physically to break the person or emotionally to break the person, or it might refer to separating them from their wives, which would be, which is again something you're not supposed to do if he's Jewish. The problem here is that the way it's written means that you would be allowed to do this with Gentile slaves. And that,
Even though it doesn't say it,
right, but it says,
but yeah.
it seems to be distinguishing it, because it says at the end, when it comes to your brethren from Israel, then you shouldn't work them before. It makes it sound like as
It
opposed to
indicates,
that you are allowed to as slaves, of Gentile slaves. So whatever the meaning, it sounds like you would be able to separate the Gentile slave from their
make
spouse,
their labors torturous and take them away from.
and separate them from their
Separate.
spouse, which doesn't sound good.
No, it does not.
The other thing is that it sounds like from here, and possibly in other places, that you might not, and this is how it's, I think,
Yeah, like
understood in the
40.
commentaries, Do you have a discussion in there at all about
When you go
slavery?
back to 44, the first line, your slave or your maidservant whom you may own from the Gentiles who surround you. From among them, you may purchase a slave or a maidservant. That sounds like right there that they can do separate purchases, so to speak.
Right, now but that might be if they're single, that you
Yeah.
could say that's
Yeah.
talking about if they're single. What if they are a married
But if
couple?
they are, can they separate a married couple?
Right, so it sounds like, at least according to the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, because he understood the word going back in Egypt, that they separated husbands from wives.
Right.
And so it sounded like if you're gonna apply that meaning over here, then it sounds like you would be able to do that for Gentile slaves.
Yeah.
What is this phrase, a man with his brother?
So in other words, he's
Oh.
still your brother. You have a Jewish slave, a Jewish servant, but he is to be treated as your brother.
The children of Israel, a man with, oh, I see. They're just saying he's your brother. Okay.
He's your
All right.
brother.
Yep.
Just want to be sure about what I'm about to say. This phrase in 45, I'm sorry, 46. Le'olam bahem ta'avodu. Le'olam bahem ta'avodu. And Arya Campbell translates that, and you shall thus have them serve you forever. So the question here is, are you allowed to free your Gentile slaves? Are you allowed to free your Gentile slaves? So this phrase sounds like it's a positive commandment to maintain them as your slaves. And that if you would free them, you would be transgressing a positive commandment. The Ibn Ezra here says, the way he translates it is, you are allowed to have them forever, that one is permitted to do so. However, since we find that the sages say that it is a commandment to do so, we accept what they say. So the Ibn Ezra says, if you look at the meaning of the verse, it sounds like you can keep them forever. But then he said that we find that in the Talmud that the sages say it's a positive commandment to keep them forever. And therefore he says, even though it doesn't seem like the simple meaning of the verse, we accept what they say. So this is a question: are you allowed to free a Gentile slave?
When they say forever, are they speaking of this one slave that you purchased or you got, and just, forever? And if you should die, your children has this person, but once that person dies, then like if he has children, they're not yours, right? I mean, when they mean forever, they just mean until his death, until the slave's death.
I would assume so. Yeah, until the slave's death, obviously. Let's just see here.
Yeah, it doesn't specifically say you get to keep the kids.
Although in other places, it does seem like you do keep the kids. So that's part of the Berkeley here, or somewhere else. It does say that the children continue to be property of the slave. Oh, we had it with the Jewish slave, as it said with the Jewish slave that he marries, the owner is allowed to give him a wife.
Here it says you may purchase children.
Right, but let's say we said by the Jewish slave that if it's not here, then it is in Mishpatim. Here, we said that the master can give him a Gentile slave to procreate with.
Right.
And then, so that must be back in Mishpatim. Let's just look back there for a second. Mishpatim. Yeah, so if you go to Exodus chapter 21, to Shemot chapter 21, Kaf Aleph, it starts off, if somebody buys a Hebrew slave, it says in verse 4, so it's chapter 21, verse 4, it says, Im Adonai v'iten lo isha v'yalda lo banim ubanot. If his master gives him a wife, we're assuming it's a Gentile slave, in other words, the wife is a Gentile slave, and she has sons or daughters, Ha'isha v'yaladeha tiyeh ladoneha v'hu yotzei b'gapo. Then the woman and her children stay with the master, or go to the master, he goes out single. So that's one of the motivations, it goes on to say, for why he wants to stay with his master, because he wants to stay with the woman and his children,
Right.
and he won't be able to. So this is one of the places that overtly says this, that the children belong to the master as well. So, so in the Talmud, there are various cases where they do talk about freeing Gentile slaves, but they make the point that if you do free a Gentile slave, he's not a free Gentile, he is a Jew. That the result of freeing a Gentile slave, he or she, is that they become Jewish. So how does that work? So what happens is, upon the initiation of their slavery, if it's a male, they are circumcised and they go to the mikvah. And they are now in some kind of in-between stage between Jewish and Gentile. From that point on, first of all, it's forbidden for them to be idolaters. You cannot maintain slaves that maintain what's considered idolatrous worship. But not just that, they are obliged in the what we say are 365 negative commandments, which means that they have to keep Shabbat just like a Jew. They have to keep Yom Tov just like a Jew. They have to keep, they may not have to keep it like a Jewish, this is the negative commandments. When I say they have to keep Shabbat, what I mean is they have to refrain from the 39 categories of forbidden work. They have to refrain from what you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. They wouldn't be able to eat on Yom Kippur. In other words, they can't do negative commandments at this point. So they're in a quasi-Jewish state. When they're freed, if there is a circumstance to free them, they are Jewish, entirely Jewish, to the point where there was somebody who suggested that because there's all sorts of concern about conversions and how serious the conversion process is. There are all sorts of people that do not convert Orthodox, because an Orthodox Beit Din is going to turn away anybody who is not willing to lead an Orthodox lifestyle, and not just an Orthodox lifestyle, but say that they're willing to lead it. The Beit Din has to believe they're going to do it, which limits the pool of people that are going to want to convert. So let's say you have the mass immigration of Russians or the people from the former Soviet Empire to Israel in the 90s, or in the late 70s, but also in the 90s. It was really a humongous amount. And it was known that many of these people are not Jewish. They're up to possibly 200, maybe even 300,000 of the people that came. If 1 million people came, the estimates were that it's in at least 200, maybe 300,000 of the people that came are not Jewish. So what do you do about this large population of Gentiles that are in Israel? Especially because if you become a citizen of Israel, you serve in the Israeli army. And they had situations where there were people who served in the Israeli army and died in defending the land of Israel, but then their families are told they cannot be buried in the military cemeteries or together with their Jewish brethren because they're not Jewish. People would be willing to be Jewish, but they don't want to live an Orthodox lifestyle. They want to be, brethren with everybody else or sisters with everybody else that's in Israel. So this created a sociological problem. And so there was a suggestion that what you could do is, this was like a creative suggestion that somebody gave, make them slaves and then free them. Because when you free a Gentile slave, it doesn't matter if they are sincere about being Jewish or not, they become Jewish. They don't have the criteria of having to accept the yoke of heaven and to commit to a scrupulous lifestyle as a Jew. Once the slave is freed, and he could be freed against his will, once he's freed, he is Jewish. So this was suggested, there's somebody wrote, I think it was part of a book that somebody wrote as a way of resolving the conversion problem in Israel, but also in America, where you have a lot of people that are considered Jewish as far as the Reform movement is concerned, or as far as the conservative movement is concerned, but are not considered Jewish as far as the Orthodox world is concerned. And in a few generations, it'd be hard to know who's Jewish and who's not Jewish. So there was somebody who suggested this for the American problem too. Just do make them all
Mass enslavement.
slaves and then free them. And then they'll be Jewish. It'll be their problem if they don't keep all the
Right.
Torah, but they will be halachically Jewish.
How do you
So-
enslave someone? What would be
Right.
the process of enslaving
So
them?
Exactly.
that was the reaction. It got a lot of difficult reaction. There was a suggestion like this made earlier to help solve the problem of a mamzer. There is a potential solution suggested by the Gemara for a mamzer, not the mamzer himself, but the children of a mamzer. Let's say you have a male mamzer, which means he was born from incest or he's born from adultery. So he's a mamzer. The problem with it's a terrible tragedy. It's not his fault, obviously, but now he has this stigma, which means that he can't marry, halachically, he cannot marry a born Jewish woman. And he just has this stigma. If he does, then his children become mamzerim, and his children's children could become mamzerim. So one of the potential solutions for this problem is find a woman who has already indicated that she wants to convert. So she's a Gentile, and she said she wants to convert. Obviously you introduce her to this man. They're willing, they're open to getting married. Okay, so now what you do is you don't convert her right away. You make her a Gentile slave, and then you make him a Jewish slave, and the Jewish slave is allowed to marry a Gentile slave, or to be in union with a Gentile slave, and then they have kids together. And when they've reached the point where they've decided they're not going to have any more kids, you free her so that now she becomes fully Jewish, and her children, you free them and they become fully Jewish. And they don't have the stigma of mamzer, because a convert, there is no mamzer status amongst Gentiles. So his children would be, perfectly Jewish without the status of being a mamzer. So that would
But not him. It would be the
Fix
next
him,
generation.
but he has a wife, he has children, and the wife and children don't have a stigma attached to them.
Okay.
So so with regard to that, Rabbi Soloveitchik said, that's, they asked about applying that now, and he said, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. In other words, you can't go back to creating slavery, even for a good cause like that. You can't go back. We're not creating slaves.
Right.
The rest of the world has already come to the understanding that slavery is not good. We're not going to institute slavery, even though you have a limited scenario where it would actually be a chesed, an act of loving kindness, and they want you to do it, but we can't do it anymore. This is also brought up when it comes to the general discussion of slavery, which is the source for being able to confidently say that nobody thinks there should be slaves nowadays. Even though the Torah seems to suggest there can, it would be considered wrong to have slaves nowadays. And that was part of his meaning also. You just can't have slaves nowadays. So, but the other problem that people mentioned is, even if you don't agree with Rabbi Soloveitchik, we don't know how to make people slaves nowadays. How would you even do it?
Poof, you're a
Right,
slave.
like how would you do it? So what you'd have to do is you'd have to go to some country that has slavery, in theory. You'd have to go to a country that has slavery, and they would have to enslave this person, I'm assuming. They would have to actually enslave the person. And then you'd buy this person from them. I'm assuming that's how you do it. And it's just a ridiculous
Yeah,
phenomenon. So it was an interesting suggestion of a solution. But so anyway, so the Gemara does, in several instances talk about the fact that if you free a slave, they become Jewish. So, and you see there are all sorts of situations where they're willing to free the slave for the sake of the slave themselves. One of the places you see this is in the Chagiga, there's a Mishnah in Chagiga where it talks about somebody who is half slave and half free. They're half slave and half free. So Hillel said, well, how do you have a case where somebody's half slave and half free? So let's say there were two owners. Let's say a man owned a slave and he died, and now there are two sons. And now the two sons both own that slave as a partnership. Now, what if one of the sons freed that slave and the other one did not? So you end up in a situation of a half slave, half not slave. So Hillel, I think the school of Hillel said, 3 days a week or 3.5 days a week, he works for this guy. 3.5 days, he's free. So he's like half slave, half free. Shammai, the school of Shammai said to the school of Hillel, that is completely unacceptable. This man is not going to be able to get married and have children because he can't marry a Gentile because he's half Jewish. And he can't marry a Jew because he's half Gentile or half slave.
Oy.
So now he's not gonna be able to get married, he's not gonna be able to have children. And this is considered unacceptable that there are human beings that can't have children. God himself said, I want you to be fruitful and multiply. He's talking to all of humanity and to fill the earth. And everybody, all humans have a right to that. It seems like a right. That seems like they're actually talking about a right to that, even though they don't typically speak of rights, or at least they'll speak of it in terms of God's intent. God's intent is that everybody do this. But it's almost like if you were talking about rights, this would be a human right, the right to have children. And then it says that the school of Hillel changed their mind, and they agreed to Shammai, and that they forced the other guy to free this servant. There are cases in the Gemara where they talk about what if you don't have a minion? What if you have 9 people and you don't have a minion, but somebody had a slave? You could free the slave in order to make a minion. So that suggests that if you have some reason that freeing this person solves some kind of problem, then you would be allowed to free them. So again, even if this seems to be transgressing, again, there is a possibility, it does seem like that from the Gemara, that it is a positive commandment to maintain ownership of the slave, and that you'd be transgressing a positive commandment by freeing them. But if there is a reason to free them that serves some divine purpose, then you're allowed to free them. And again, once you free them, they become Jewish. The other way that a Gentile slave becomes freed, and this was discussed earlier, is if they become injured by their master. And one of the ways so there are 2 injuries that are cited. One is if they are blinded, or if their tooth is knocked out. So there are
Blinded, I can see.
right. That would require some investigation as to why taking out a tooth represents a reason to free them.
Does that apply to one eye?
Yeah, one eye. Blind them in one eye and free them.
Yeah,
And
because if they blinded them in both eyes, they become useless to them.
right. So that would be another way that they would become free. And you see this come up about that there were certain masters who wanted to be their slave, so they would
Knock out a tooth.
basically knock out a tooth in order to free them. And that would also get rid of this problem, this positive commandment to maintain them. But when you're trying to explain slavery in the Torah, this is one of your challenges.
Yes.
This section that we're in here has two phrases that are real challenges to trying to explain the Torah's attitude towards slaves as being benevolent. One is that you are for some reason allowed to work them before, that you would be able to work them in a way that is harsh and would break either their body, their spirit, and or that you, according to the Rush, it sounds like you would be able to separate husbands from wives. And that's hard to explain. And then also the prohibition against freeing them. At first blush, that's hard to explain. Again, you could go to the Gemara where you see where you see that exactly how it looks, but even there, it's still sort of rough.
You know, Rabbi, I wonder if it's trying to stress the idea that Hashem frees slaves. Do you know what I mean? The whole stress on I took you out, I made you not slaves. Only I can do that. And
It's a prerogative of God.
Right. And this is kind of stressing that idea.
I like that. Again, there might be some exceptions to that, but the general notion of it, I hear that. I like that.
And also, I wonder the rationale being, we don't want people, the reason they become Jewish when they're free, we don't want non-Jews running around Israel. Well, I'm trying to figure that into it too. You know what I mean? I don't know.
In other words, why can't they just be Noachim
Right.
or something? You're not allowed to sell them. Once they are owned by Jews, you're not allowed to sell them to idolaters.
Oh.
Because you don't want them to go back to worshiping idols. So you're not allowed to sell them to idolaters. You are allowed to sell them to other Jews, but you're not allowed to sell them to idolaters. Also, we just had in Kesubos, we had that if you have a Gentile slave and you want to move from Israel to outside Israel, the Gentile slave has a right to refuse.
Oh.
He has a right to refuse. Anybody in the family has a right to refuse. So if a couple are married and the husband wants to leave Israel, the wife can say, we're not moving. And then the court say, well, if you want to go, you have to divorce her and you're going to have to pay her ketubah. If
That explains the whole thing.
right, but even it says even a Gentile slave can refuse to go, and then what would happen is they'd be forced to free him in the land of Israel, and then he would be Jewish. So that's probably, there are other scenarios, I guess, where you could force a situation where the slave would become Jewish, right? But that's a good question: is why do we need him to be Jewish? it could be that, because even the Noahites are not bound by the negative commandments. He has become bound by the negative commandments. So you'd be setting him back to, because he has, let's say, 365 commandments, and the Noahide only has 7. So if you made him a Noahide, now he's going from 365 back to 7. It could be that that's the problem. Is you can't send him back to a lesser degree of responsibility of observance. Something like that. I'm not sure.
If he wants to.
Right, it may
He
not
doesn't have
matter.
that, he
No,
doesn't have that
He's a
choice.
slave.
He's
you
a
know.
slave, and once a slave, and even when free,
Right, so because the process, once he becomes free, now he gets to make his own choices.
okay.
But even the freedom itself, again, we're talking about a situation that's hard to explain in the first place. But,
Yeah,
but,
for
but
sure.
it seems like that up until the point that he's free, he doesn't get to make those
Yeah,
choices.
doesn't get to choose.
Right, so this is it's a very hard topic, and it's lots of people have tried to explain it.
I like Lois's thought.
That's one of them.
That-
It seems like once you're in the purview of a Jew, you can't do those other things. I mean, it,
Yeah.
it kind of rubs off on you, even if you're not, you know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah,
The one that's a little bit harder is it does that, the way it compares it, it makes it seem like you are allowed to work a Gentile slave in a backbreaking way.
yeah.
That's
harder
just
than-
hard. That's hard. That's a hard
Yeah.
one.
That's the hard one.
All right, we'll wait to become wiser.
Oh, next
For
week we'll be
understanding.
wiser.
That's it. Next week we'll be wiser. And by
We'll be
next week,
older
I'm
and
sure-
wiser.
Older and wiser. That's it.
All right, you guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi, so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I'm
You're
so
welcome.
confused.